One thing about recording, so if you guys haven't noticed, but I wasn't able to post the lectures from last week. What happened was when I uploaded them to YouTube, I got copyright claimed because of the videos I showed in class. So I don't know how to edit them out. So I'm really sorry about that. I didn't even know that would be a problem. So in the future, if I do use any videos, I'll be more mindful to pause the recording so that I don't have that issue in the future. I've never used YouTube until like this semester, so I didn't even know that was a thing. Okay. So in terms of next week, so looking at the schedule, looking at the draft, the rough draft is due at 8 a.m. on Monday morning. And that's primarily so you guys can have a draft done so that when you're conferencing with me, I can give you feedback on your essay. So you know like what you're doing well, what you need to improve on. So it's more driven in terms of that revision process, especially since we're not going to have our official class meetings next week because of conferencing. So I'm going to be using the ConferZoom through Canvas for scheduling. So under our class Canvas page, you just go to ConferZoom and then it'll bring up the different options. So if you go to appointment booking, that's where you'll see the different appointment blocks that I have available for conferencing. So in terms of it, you can choose the day and time that works best for you. For the most part, I have the blocks open from 8:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. so that you guys have a lot of options. I am conferencing with my English 100W online class next week as well. So you just be mindful if you do need a set time, you want to make that appointment as quick as possible. So under the appointment booking, you can see the appointment blocks. You can see I already have a few appointments already scheduled. And you can choose the specific day and time that works for you. So in terms of accessing the conference, basically on that day and on that time, instead of looking for the Zoom code that I post, you actually go back to ConferZoom to that appointment and you access it there. So it'll open directly and you could either have it be in that window or to open onto another screen. If for some reason there's a time that doesn't work for you and you need to schedule one that's outside of these appointment blocks, just let me know and then we can figure something out. But essentially for this module as well, because I added it, so it's 3.8, so I did add it to this week's module. I do have the instructions, so if for some reason like you're doing it later and need to change, I do have the breakdown there of how to make and schedule that appointment. Okay. So any questions about conferencing next week? So we're going to do conferencing instead of class. So essentially, rough draft due 8 a.m. on Monday. Whatever conference time you have with me is the only time you'll be meeting for this class next week. And then our peer reviews are going to be due on Canvas by the end of next Friday. So essentially, all of next week is just focusing on the revision for this paper for you guys. And outside of conferencing, like I'm still going to be responding to emails or questions like normal. So you can just let me know before or after the conference if you do have a specific question and I can address that.
Gotcha. Okay, so if we have like our conference with you on Monday, then that's it basically until the next Monday, right? Aside from
Yes.
like questions. Okay.
So unless, depending on the conference schedule, like if there are appointments later in the week that are available, like you can schedule another one. I just want to give all of you guys and everyone in my other class time to schedule their conferences first before I schedule second meetings with anybody. So it may be an option if you have like an early week appointment, but if you're not able to schedule a second meeting, they can help you just through email as well. So questions, concerns about that?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
So from what I'm understanding, this, let's see, the following week is going to be like the conference week, but you want us to have our paper or our draft done by Monday, and then as well the peer review is going to be due by the end of that week.
So yeah, so Monday 8 a.m. So if we go to, sorry, I haven't posted it officially because I haven't decided if I'm making any more changes to it. So for our rough draft for paper 1, so essentially since I'm starting conferencing with our class specifically on Monday, having it done by 8 a.m. on Monday is just that due date in terms of making sure that everybody has a rough draft done. So if you have a Monday or early week appointment, then there's something for us to work with. It's also due that time, even if you have an appointment later in the week, primarily because of the peer reviews. So for peer reviews, since I want to make sure you guys have time to read and give genuine comments to your classmates, and you have to complete 3 peer reviews by the end of day on Friday. So it gives you plenty of time to work on your own essay and then give feedback on your classmates' essays.
Okay, got it. And then as well, I'm seeing on the page that you're sharing right there, you're going to have that information as well.
Yes, so this is essentially what that assignment, so once it's posted on Friday, what it'll look like. I haven't decided if I'm going to change or add additional like peer review questions or detract them, so that's why that's in red. So essentially how Canvas works for peer review, have you guys used Canvas for peer review in the past? I don't know, last semester when things went online?
No, the way I had a previous English teacher do it was they just, through our Google Docs, she just sent us like random people and shared our own documents within. I don't know how they did it, and that's how we did it.
So this makes it like a little bit easier for me and then for you guys like accessing the Google Docs. So if you do have any issues like for this, just let me know since I've never done the Google Doc thing before. So essentially when you guys submit your rough drafts to Canvas, I have it set up where it releases the 3 peer reviews of your classmates to you right at 8:01 a.m. that same day. So instead of like having to wait for me to give you the different peer reviews for you guys to respond to, and then essentially it does it for you. And then of course, so you guys are reviewing through Canvas. So Canvas has it set up where you can actually make annotations on the different documents, similar to like how I would when I'm grading your final papers. So you can add comments to and highlight things, as well as leave comments like on the right hand side. So when you are reviewing like your essay that's been peer reviewed, like you can see the comments that everybody has left in that one place, as well as the comments that they type up. One thing to note with peer review is like you don't see the other people reviewing that essay. It's just the person who's being reviewed can see all of the comments that they've been given. And then I can see everybody's comments. Does that make sense? And I do have a little video here, so it's a little tutorial about how to use the comments in Canvas specifically. So essentially, do you guys want me to play it now, or do you guys think it's fine and I can just address any questions later? Or I can like model how that's done with one of your guys' assignments that I haven't graded yet.
Do you want to model it?
Want to model it? Any volunteers for assignments? Oh. Someone in the chat. We have Alex, go ahead. Alex, does that mean you're volunteering, or what is the go ahead in reference to? One thing about like the Zoom chat is I really wish it gave a timestamp.
I think it was for the playing the video.
They're playing the video. Okay, show us, sorry, okay. So, sorry, this is the assignment from last week. Sorry, I'm going one that has a document. So, sorry, Gustavo. Oh, one thing else to note, I'm sorry I'm a little behind on grading. I've skimmed through things, but I've just been on top of planning ahead for a class. So I am planning on getting caught up on grading by the end of this week. So if you're concerned about that for grades, I'm really sorry. This first few weeks, it's been a lot of the planning work. So if you look at, this is essentially similar to what you guys would see for peer review. So you would have that document, and uploading a document is really important for you guys to be able to add the comments to it. So on that document, you do have options here. So for instance, we have this one, which I think it says pinpoint. So it gives you a little colored dot, and essentially say you want to add a comment to a certain section, or say you want to add something there, you can just click that and then put it onto wherever on the page you want to leave that comment, and then you can write it in, right? And then of course, if you decide that you don't want to leave that comment again, you can just delete it and it'll go away. Say for instance, you want to highlight something more specific and leave a comment, so you can choose the highlighter. You can choose like the different color you want to highlight. So if you want to emphasize in different ways, and then you can just highlight. Sorry, my computer's being a little slow. There we go. Highlight the section you want to leave the comment on, and you see it highlights, and then it has the little text box, so you can add in your comment that way. And say if generally you just want to type in a text box, you can. And you can just type in and just have it generally on the side instead of referring specifically to the text. Or if you want to strike something out, say you don't like a part of that sentence, does it make sense to you? You can strike it out and just write in like why you had a problem with that, or just strike it out. So it does have a lot of options for peer reviewing. So any questions about how to leave the comments on the text on Canvas? So it's fairly easy. It gives you a lot of different options. And then of course, you don't have to wait for me to send them. And of course, it's just easy to access. I feel like it gives you more opportunity to leave more comments than Google Docs does, especially like if it's depending on what type of file they give you. James had the question. It does save automatically, so you don't have to worry about saving. I can see all of the comments that you leave for your classmates, as well as you guys can see all the comments that your peers give you as well. So it saves automatically, so if you only are able to respond to a part of it at one time and then you have to go back later, you don't have to worry about basically having to restart. You can just return to the document and then add your additional comments at any time. So, any questions? So also similar, it also on the right-hand side have for assignment comments. So you can respond to the different peer review questions there. So those are the more just general feedback about the overall essay versus comments about the specific elements of each paragraph. So questions about peer review. I just wanted to make sure you guys had plenty of time to be able to work on them, which is why you guys have the full 5 days, so that you guys can give thorough comments. And if you have any questions or issues, you can let me know and we can figure something else out. Just because it is a new system for you guys to be using. Okay. So questions about peer review or conferencing before we get into drafting? Val, I think your microphone's not working.
No? Hello?
I can hear you now.
Okay, cool. Just quick question. On the appointment booking for the draft, with conference.
Mhm.
Are we available to book that after class? Because I looked into it and I can't.
After class today?
Yeah, like when you book it, can you book the appointment in advance?
Yeah, so you should be able to book it now under Confer Zoom.
Okay, because I
'Cause I
tried to do it.
know.
I tried to do it a little while ago, and I went under agenda. Nothing's there. That's why. But we could talk about it later.
Let me double check just to make sure, because I
Because I
know.
actually went into the modules to look at that example of the screenshots that you left, and
Mhm.
it just showed like the first or second window, which is exactly what you did, which was conference, Zoom, and then booking or something like that. I
Yeah,
gotta look at
so Confer Zoom appointment booking.
it. And then I went and my tab's on agenda, and doesn't have anything. But it's probably, I'm assuming because you probably just made it, and it's not available to us until after class, maybe?
No, it should
I was able
be
to
because I
just go on.
know,
Do you guys got it? Because maybe I'm clicking somewhere else, but I can
because I
find it
can
later.
see Eva was able to sign up already.
Okay,
And then
interesting.
Vivian said she did hers this morning. Um,
Oh,
so
I'll find it. No worries.
in terms of that, like we can talk about at the end of class, and like you can show me your screen and maybe we can figure it out. Because like the
Okay.
one tough thing, what I'm planning with Confer Zoom is I don't know what you guys are necessarily seeing when I
Right.
set it up for it.
Okay.
So Giselle is saying click on book appointment with. So I think you have to choose specifically with me.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of off because you're the only class I have this semester. It's okay though. I'll figure it out.
Well, we can talk it about at the end of class, so I can help you with that. And of course, if anyone else is having issues with it, just let me know.
Okay.
Just because
Thank
it
you.
is something I haven't used before, so I just want to make sure it's working properly, and then
For,
fix any of those different things.
for me, it's not giving me an option to pick a booking date or like time or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I would check that thing out, guys, before you leave
Okay.
today.
'Cause I don't even get any like links when I click onto the conference Zoom. Like it just shows me dates and no like options to.
Yeah, that's what I
Okay.
see. I got dates 9 and then 9 through 15, which is Wednesday to Tuesday, but it says
Okay.
no upcoming appointments shown.
Yeah, same.
So
Oh no,
the
actually,
7th.
I figured it out. There is like a little drop menu, and it pulls up the professor's.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I found it. Thank you guys.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you
Found
guys.
it.
Now I know to look for the drop menu.
Drop menu, that's what it was. Thank you.
Any other questions about that? I think you guys solved it.
Oh, just one more quick question on there. If we select a date and then are we able to change it just in case, like not last minute, but something happens and you can't attend that appointment? Can you change it if it's available? Okay.
Yeah. So if you can change it, it should give you the option to delete the original appointment. But if for some reason you have issues with that, you can just email me that you want to kind of cancel that appointment and you changed it to a different one. But it should already give you the option so you can schedule on a different day without, because I don't have it set up where you're limited to just one appointment. Any other questions about it? Or does that clarify for you, Virginia?
Yes, it does.
Okay, awesome. So of course, like since this is new, it's the first time we're doing it. Like if you do have any issues, just feel free to email me so we can figure it out and troubleshoot it. And of course, with conferencing, yeah, because I know schedules do change, especially when we're doing online classes. And of course, with a lot of you guys are working as well. So for some reason you do need to change your appointment because you're not sure or your schedule shifts, just let me know or just reschedule it. So getting into drafting for our first paper, so you guys can have that guidance as you're working on your rough draft for the remainder of the week and of course over the weekend. We didn't have time last class to really break down that prompt. So I wanted to take some time to really go over it. So since we really haven't talked as a class about this specific prompt, or like the different cues, the different like reading strategies we can use to make sure we're deciphering prompts correctly, so that we're always responding to the assignment in the way that kind of fulfills all of the different risk requirements. So in terms of the prompt, I know it was part of last week's module. Did any of you guys have any issues accessing it or going it over it, or did you guys have any initial questions you wanted to ask about it, or any concerns? Silence. I'm assuming that means it's fine.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at different prompts, and you can always just chime in if you do have a question that comes to mind. So when we're looking at different prompts, when we're deciphering them, really we want to break down how a prompt is organized. So for this prompt, really, I have it broken down into different sections. So we can actually chart the different sections and like, what is it offering to the prompt? What is it telling us about this assignment? Especially in terms of figuring out, like, out of all that text, which the most important ones for us as we're working on the essay. So the beginning part, right, if we look at here, which, let me draw. If we look at the first two sections, the first two paragraphs, we really want to ask, like, how are those paragraphs functioning? So if we read through those silently to yourself, like, how can we kind of paraphrase, like, what purpose would you guys say those two paragraphs hold for the prompt itself? Any thoughts? What do you guys think? We have that first one, which is literally a sentence. Our class meetings and assignments this week have centered around language diversity, what language diversity is, why language diversity matters, and how language as well as multilingualism has changed over time. And then we get more specific to, in the United States, language diversity is a complex issue because even though there isn't one official national language, not all languages are viewed in the same way. In our article, Language, Diversity and Learning, Lessons for Education in the 21st Century, Sony Nieto specifically notes that whether diversity is seen in the positive or negative light, depending on competing principles that have coexisted throughout our history, the ideology of exclusion and dominance sees diversity negatively, evaluating different groups as insiders versus outsiders and assigning different power to them. John McWhirter's The Evolution of Like and Peter Hessler's The Case for Embracing Linguistic Identities further Nieto's points surrounding language diversity. So what would you guys say the purpose is for those first two paragraphs for this prompt, as we're deciphering kind of what it is we should be paying attention to? Any guesses?
Change in diversity as a history of it.
Yeah, so it's really setting up the context.
Yeah, like the intro.
So very similar to like an introduction for an essay that you guys would write.
Right.
So it's setting up the context, the history, like the issue.
Setting up the
right?
story.
Yeah, essentially. Really defining it for you so that you guys are on the same page. So if we think about it, right, prompts usually have some type of context. So when we're looking for the main thing we want to focus on, very similar to Arnie said the preface, so the context, that purpose, it is basically just like a preface for a book. So essentially most prompts, most assignments don't just like give you the requirements, they set up kind of where this is coming from, very similar to you guys and how you're responding. So essentially, if we think of the context, it's really telling us like what conversation we're entering into, and of course, like what background we've gone over, so you remember, and it's reinforcing that those are the ideas that you're going to be talking about. So whenever we look at a prompt and we have like the purpose, the context for it, we know that that's not where we're looking for the requirements for that essay, right? That's just setting up kind of what it is we're going to be talking about, or what ideas from class we're going to be referring to, especially when we're later in the semester, when we're going to be shifting to other topics. So it's really kind of like breaking it down for us. So with language cues for prompts like this one, right? One thing that you can note when we're looking at prompts is prepositional phrases like for this paper or for this assignment. So that is linguistically telling us like this is what we are specifically focusing on. So that works as especially what we call like a transition. From that context to now what you need to be paying more attention to within this assignment specifically. And then consider the ideas, examples, and issues that Nieto, McWhorter, and Hessler present, and respond to the following questions in order to inform your readers about how language diversity has affected your life. So what language within that sentence stands out to you guys that really guides you and tells you how you need to be responding to this prompt?
Well, it says you're informing your reader.
Yeah, so informing is really important. Sorry, that's a really terrible circle. I've never missed a whiteboard more than when I'm trying to annotate something.
Right.
So inform your reader.
Mm-hmm.
So that is specifically, if we think about inform, that's the verb that's telling you what you're going to be doing. So what is inform specifically saying about this essay type? Like what writing mode is this essay, or is inform wanting you to use?
MLA.
That is the organizational guidelines.
Oh, okay.
So inform specifically, because you're right, we do
inform,
need to use MLA,
Mm-hmm.
but what does that verb inform? What writing type is that telling us to respond with? Because remember, we talked about we have descriptive writing, we have narrative writing, expository writing, argumentative writing, and analytical writing.
I would say it's narrative because you're informing him. But if you read on, it says inform how diversity has affected your life.
Yeah. So of course, it's that personal element, which definitely links with narrative writing, especially like the emphasis on your life. So that means a lot of the examples, they do have to center on you. So that means in how you respond, you do want to use first person. To emphasize that, use your own examples instead of having outside research. So in terms of the narrative, right, inform, it's changing that purpose. So it's not necessarily to like entertain. Inform also functions in terms of fitting into explaining, which would be expository writing. Because if we think of like the purpose of like writing a narrative to inform, it's to like really show and really explain to somebody what's going on. Dan, were you going to add something to
question
that?
from James.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. change the context and write a counter argument. So in terms of counter argument, like what do you mean change the context? Can you be a little bit more specific, James? You mean create a counter argument against language diversity, or? Yes, okay. So in terms of, for the questions that I'm asking you to respond to, it has to really, in terms of that counter argument, since this isn't asking you to respond with an argumentative essay, then you wouldn't necessarily present a counter argument in the same way. So really, if it's something like you want to talk about like against language diversity, that would really come into how you respond to the specific questions to inform about your experience and explain your experience with this. So does that make sense in terms of that? Okay, awesome. So if you do ever need more clarity, just let me know. So really in terms of the next part, so we have that inform. Any other words in that sentence before we get to the bullet points that stand out to you guys that really tell us like how we're responding to these things? If we think about the verbs in that sentence that are really directing you, we have that first one, so consider, and then we have respond. So how are they directing you guys in terms of how you're informing your readers or what you're informing your readers about? Like what does really consider tell us about how you guys are going to be informing readers?
So I mean, with considering the ideas and examples and issues, I mean, you can consider in a fact that you might have similar thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the ideas and the examples might be the same, or they could be, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, and that's going to kind of set you up on how you want to respond. You know, you're either going to say, hey, this example makes sense. You know, I felt the same way, or, you know, these things didn't apply to how I grew up. You know, so because we're all in a sense going to have agreements with similar things, but not everyone's going to have that same diversity, you know, in certain areas. So it's going to, you know, give a different response.
Yeah, especially looking at how you guys all responded to the discourse communities discussion posts, right? Well, all of you guys identified discourse communities you're part of. Not everybody was in the same discourse communities, right? We had a huge list from like occupation, so those who work with customers or patients in like the healthcare field, or even with those who have been in the military, right? How that really changes discourse communities. Sports was a big one that came up as well. Rochelle added, consider can be in from comparing the similarities, facts, examples from the 3 different articles reflecting on our own experiences. For some, this can help break down body paragraphs for each article. Yeah, definitely. So comparing, similar to what Dan was saying, to what they present, either if you had similar or if you had different, right? And of course, consider also functions in a different way. So consider implies like you're just thinking about those when you're responding. It doesn't mean you have to talk about them, because it's not saying, it's not telling you specifically to analyze their ideas or explain their ideas. So considering it just you in your mind, and then how much you want to use them in your body paragraphs is really just up to you guys. If you want to compare your experiences with theirs, either to show the similarities or those differences. Anything else you guys would add about consider? I think you guys had some really good points. What about respond? How does that guide you guys, and then tell you about how you're informing your readers? Any ideas or thoughts?
Well, it's saying like respond to the following questions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's giving you like the direction that your paper needs to go in.
Yeah. So in terms of it's guiding and what you're informing your readers about.
Yeah.
So you're not just informing them about this, like you have to cover these 3 questions, right? So in terms of how I'm grading, right, I'm looking specifically for you guys to specifically essentially answer and then explain your responses to those questions. So very similar to how you guys were saying in terms of, so I'm trying to not have that go onto the black part of this screen so it's easier for you to read. So in what I'm looking for you guys to inform, I'm looking to see that you're checking those boxes. So another way that that works in terms of breaking down those body paragraphs is breaking down how you're responding to those 3 questions in your body paragraphs. So very similar to how Rochelle in the chat said, comparing the similarities examples and like how that can help you break down your body paragraphs, you can do that with responding to these 3 different questions. So you have one body paragraph talking about when you've been an insider versus outsider, one about the differences, basically the discourse communities you engage in and how they communicate differently. So you can narrate that, especially in that comparison. And then finally, how have they changed in your lifetime? Which if we think of like the language of these questions, what language within those questions really kind of sets them apart? Especially if we think of that last one I already mentioned with changed. So if we think of how that's asking you to respond, like how is changed in your lifetime telling you should explain that one? Or inform your reader about that one specifically.
What's the question again? Sorry.
So what has changed in that question? How have your experience with language changed in your lifetime? How is that question specifically telling you guys to respond to it with the word changed?
So it could be anything from how you use language as a child to an adult, your communities.
Yeah, so setting up a comparison, essentially. Yeah. A comparison, and then also in terms of how you can present that comparison, it can just focus on the characteristics or it can narrate them. I'm sorry, Jaden, were you going to add on to that?
Yeah, I just said you can give examples of those experiences comparing.
Yeah. So there's different options for how you can show that change. You could even use cause and effect to show that change, or even like process analysis. Because I think cause and effect, you can show like what led you to change how you communicated or how your language diversity changed. So I know within the discussion post that you guys had last week about this, there are a few military members and and I'm not sure if we have any currently serving. Is anyone currently serving in the military? I don't think so. I think it was mainly like ex-military. But so if we think of, a lot of you guys noticed how like when you guys were in the military, like you spoke differently. One person noted like they started cursing more. So you can do like the cause and effect of like cause, joining the military, effect, cursing more. Or using different language. I think another one was saying, I think it was SL. Do you remember which one that was? Or I might have that acronym wrong. I probably do. As you could probably tell, haven't served in the military.
What was it? What are you trying to ask?
There was one discussion post that had like an abbreviation. Maybe it ended with a C, something Charlie.
Oh, Lima Charlie?
That might be it, yeah. Was that yours?
Yeah. And you're doing like a radio call?
Yeah, so like that language, I got the acronym completely
There's
wrong
so
because
many acronyms.
I'm not part of that discourse community in this.
Yeah. Did you see that question in chat?
Let's see. Thank you for pointing it out. Can you also note new languages you may have learned over time? Yes. So that is what you can present within like how it's changed. So if you've acquired new languages over time, then you could talk about that. The acquisition of it. Because I know a lot of you guys from our conversations are bilingual. I wish I could say that, but I took French for 4 years and God knows that's gone. It was not practical except for the 1 week I was in France. So you can respond to that in different ways. In terms of the first two questions, if we think of like the language, how you can explicitly present this is you want to be explicit for that first one about identifying insider versus outsider. So if you want to make it very clear how you're responding to the prompt, you can use that language to mirror, to identify like this is how I'm responding to that. So for instance, you guys identified a lot of discourse communities you guys are a part of. So can you guys think of discourse communities that you feel like you're not a part of, that you've been around and you're just like, I don't know what language you're speaking, or I don't know what terminology, what slang you're using, or whatever it may be. I know for me, I have some friends who have kids now, and I had like, well, before quarantine, when I had dinner with friends that had kids, they started talking about like all this parenting stuff, and I was completely lost. So I felt like an outsider because it's like, I have nothing to contribute to this conversation unless I want to talk about my cats as my kids, and then I'm just going to look like that crazy cat lady, which I fully embrace. But can you guys think of discourse communities that you feel? So James said chemistry. Yeah, so if there's like a specific subject matter that you feel like you weren't able to like converse in confidently at some point. I think Gustavo, you started to unmute yourself. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was gonna say like I guess like elderly people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Like,
so that
I
can
looked at
definitely
my grandma,
be.
she like old people, and we like play bingo, I guess, and some like little games that they do before this whole quarantine thing.
Yeah. So outsiders could definitely be different generations because, of course, as we've already noted, different generations talk differently. We tend to have like different interests. I completely zone out when my parents talk about stuff. So that would definitely work.
I would say mechanics for a lot of people.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Mechanics. Yeah. Not gonna lie, when I get my car serviced, I'm just like, just do what you want, because it just does not make sense to me. So I probably definitely have paid more than I needed to. So mechanics, so different service industries. I know I've never worked like in a restaurant as a server or hostess or anything. So I have friends who have, and they've talked about it, and I have been confused. So it could be different occupations.
Be thankful.
I have worked at a Dairy Queen in high school. That was my one food industry job, and all I can say is never eat at a Dairy Queen for numerous reasons. We're just going to leave it at that. Any other examples of discourse communities that you felt like an outsider?
Religion. I mean, even though I practiced it, like, was meant to go as a kid, like the way older people talked about it versus like, how we
Yeah.
learned, and just see the, the changes over time. Like, used to be, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or, Holy Ghost, and then changed to Spirit. And all sorts of things have changed now. And it's like when I went on deployment and I came back and I went to church for the first time, like I was gone during a bunch of changes, and I was just like, so like my brain clicked in, that muscle memory, and I'm just like reading stuff, and then like all of a sudden I'm saying the old version and everyone's saying the new version. I was like, what?
Yeah. So I think religion's really good. I know some people did comment on it, even different religions. So people who practice differently, you talk about it differently, right? Or your knowledge about different practices is kind of like how different, even with Christianity, like the different ways people view baptism and like when you baptize really changes. I grew up Catholic, so you're baptized like as soon as possible.
Yeah. And everyone looks at confession like it's super weird and unnormal.
Yeah, because I think like Baptists, like most Christian churches don't do confession except for Catholics. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. We're just about the only ones that, confess to someone in the room.
I
And
always
same
have
thing
said,
with the saints and all that. The whole saint thing is weird to people too. And,
oh yeah.
well, let's could go on.
The biggest thing that, because I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore, except for my Catholic guilt that still stayed.
Yeah, like I try to go to all the, so I mean, I had a pretty good group of friends growing up, so I try to go to all the different churches. Like I went to like a Mormon mass and all that stuff, and it just was like, what I mean? You could show up to a Catholic church and like you said, like even if you're not practicing, you can go back 4 years later and you could still pretty much figure out the motions and go through it all. But like my buddy was saying, like theirs is always different, and just it was strange. Even going to like temple and stuff was eye-opening, seeing like Muslims and all that stuff, and like experiencing that. It's a trip. Like the language is there, it's just how they talk about it. You know what I mean? Like there's that one same idea. It's just everyone tells the story differently, basically, which is kind of cool to see. But yeah, there's times that like they say something and you're like, wait, who? Like it doesn't add up. But then you think about it and you're like, oh, that person. Yeah, I knew that. Like,
definitely. And how they teach the Bible differently. I know I went to like a Christian service once, and it was just a lot of singing, and I was so lost because they weren't like the Catholic hymns that I was familiar with. I was like, who made up these songs? So religion, I know a lot of people put discourse communities about sports. So if you think about sports that you never played, if you've been around those, the different language, the jargons can be kind of an example that you could have. I know in this class we had like basketball, I think there was soccer and hockey. So that's something that you can call attention to as well.
I was gonna say, even within the military, like there's certain things like everybody from every branch understands, but then once you go into each branch, it's same thing with like sports. Like you could talk about sports as a whole, but once you break it down into individual sports, like you're like, what?
Yeah. So if we think of the difference between that first and that second question is primarily focused on that first one on outsider and insider, right? And then that second one is focused specifically on the discourse communities that you engage in and how. So that emphasis being that how, so really explaining that how. And then if we think of this next part, so successful papers, well, so this is just, if we think about it, guidelines for grading. So things I'm looking for that are separate from how you're responding necessarily to these questions. So it needs to be clearly organized. So that's essentially saying clear different paragraphs, right? Identifiable thesis, 3 concrete topic sentences that connect to the thesis, concrete examples to illustrate your points, and then the discussion of the relevance of those examples and the clear reasoning. So just breaking down the different things that I want you guys to pay attention to. So any questions about that? Does that help? Does it make a little bit more sense in terms of how you respond?
Mm.
Can you guys hear what my computer chimes when I get an email?
No.
Okay. Sorry, it keeps like distracting me, and then I'm just worried that you guys are hearing it. That's so funny. I don't know why I'm hearing it and you guys can't. Okay. Does everyone have this down? Is it okay? Because when I clear it, then it's not going to save it. Doesn't even need a second to either take a picture of this. It'll also be on the video.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So moving forward, because we only have a little over an hour left, I wanted to give us time for brainstorming, which I think we've gotten through a little bit. Do you guys want to take a little bit more time for brainstorming? Or did you guys have any questions about brainstorming I can help you guys with? You can always leave a thumbs up if you guys are good. Awesome. Okay, so perfect. So moving forward, right? So now we're just like focusing on how we're putting this together. And of course, the different things that we're looking for in terms of how we can respond. So in terms of our thesis, since in terms of what I'm looking for, the grading guidelines for successful papers, it says that I do want an easily identifiable thesis that responds to the prompt. So that means very specific things. So if we think about it, a strong thesis statement for an informative essay or personal informative essay, what that really means is we're looking for you to respond to those 3 questions in 1 sentence, which sounds pretty difficult sometimes. So really, if we think of the thesis, we essentially want to guide the essay, right, in how you're responding. So you don't need to go into details specifically in terms of that. You just need to have the main ideas presented. So if we think of the main ideas for these questions, right, what would the main idea be that you really need to focus on and how you respond to those questions? Like, what do you need to introduce to guide, like, to our body paragraphs? Because our topic sentences, those are when we're going to get more specific. If we think of the main ideas, one thing is we want to make sure that you are the subject. So the subject of the sentence should be I, to make it very clear that you're responding with your personal experiences. You're adding it to this conversation surrounding language diversity. And then what else do we really need to identify in that thesis statement?
Just had it and just poofed out of my brain. Hold on, sorry.
No worries. It happens. especially after a 3-day weekend, especially when you haven't had enough coffee.
Oh, so I was going to say something along the lines of like how this is how language diversity has affected my life in, different ways, because then it kind of gives you the ability to go into, those 3 questions.
Mm-hmm. So you definitely need to tie in like language diversity for your life. So very similar, so you said this is how language diversity has affected my life, or you can say in terms of identifying like the discourse communities, you can specifically identify the specific discourse community. Cannot type this morning. Or communities that you're going to be talking about. So you don't need to go into depth of like the change. You don't necessarily have to talk about the how or the outsiders yet. We're just indicating specifically that you're the subject, you're talking about your language diversity or your experience with language diversity, and then introducing the discourse communities that you're part of that you're going to be talking about. So can we think of like a sample thesis statement? Does one come to mind? One that can kind of come up, I have experienced language diversity by being a part of, and then I can present the discourse communities I'm talking about for myself. So it's short, it's to the point, because of course, we're just guiding our readers. We don't necessarily have to give them too many details in our thesis. We're just guiding them for what they should be expecting in our body paragraphs. So any questions about that? Or would you guys want another sample thesis statement that we can kind of brainstorm together?
You can use like a question as a thesis statement, kind of, right? Or no?
It really depends on the essay type. So in terms of, for this essay, since I'm asking for a clearly identifiable thesis, I would say not to. You can guide into your thesis with it, with the question and then like how you respond. So like for like future essays, say once we get into like argumentative writing, for I think our 4th or 3rd and 4th paper, that's when you could have like a question as the thesis statement, because that would be a transitional question. So a good rule of thumb is like whenever in the instructions it's telling you to have like a clearly identifiable thesis, then that's looking for a statement and not a question or an implied thesis.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So James added, struggling to learn a second language or subject and how it changed over a time. Definitely. So you could even begin with the same route. So I have experienced language diversity by struggling to learn a second language and changing how I communicate over time. So essentially, like the root of this one staying the same, we could just end that last part and how we change that by. because of course how James had worded that by struggling like to learn a second language, right? That's saying that for the discourse communities, right, learning that second language, that's a new discourse community you're becoming a part of. Even if we think about language classes, those are discourse communities in and of themselves. So any other questions about our thesis before we move on? Or anyone else wanting another example? Another way we can word this, so we have diversity in terms of how we can word our theses or theses. I'm going to use James as an example. Let me see if I can copy and paste it. Yeah, we can even begin with the prepositional phrase. So by struggling to learn a second language, I have experienced language diversity. So it says the same thing, it just has a different variety in terms of how we say it. Questions? I'm going to clear it and we can move on.
Could you even say something like along the lines of, from the time I was young until now, I've experienced language diversity, in multiple communities?
Yeah.
Something along those lines. Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. So my kind of sample theses, they're shorter, so you can elaborate that on that. I was just kind of giving you like the very root of it, but that sounded perfect, Dan. So once you have your thesis statement and you have like how you're responding and guiding the reader, for that introduction, since I know we had the readings on Canvas for this, I just wanted to touch on it a little bit because of course this is an informative essay, right? So even though it's personally giving your basically language diversity, your experiences with discourse communities, that's at the root of it, we still, in a very similar way to the prompt, want to set up the context, especially since for informative essays, you can't assume an audience is as familiar with that topic as you are. So you really want to set that tone. So when you think about general organization for introductions 99% of the time tend to follow this upside down triangle format. Have you guys ever seen that before or talked about that in previous writing classes? You can do like a thumb up if yes, thumbs down if no. Is that pretty familiar with you guys? So if you guys in the chat are saying yes. So we tend to use that a lot in writing classes because of course it's the easiest to follow in terms of guiding how to organize an intro. Because of course, the reason we start broad, as you guys probably have heard before, is we need to introduce that general topic, right? To set up that context very similarly to how I did that in the prompt. So that's where we would have our hook. So that should be the most broad point of our thesis statement, right? Because we never want to start with our own response to this essay. We need to start with informing the audience about it. So one really common strategy for a hook in starting the conversation is questions. So you can have, what is language diversity? And then you can define what that is so that you're getting your audience on the same page, using the same definition of language diversity so that they understand how you're using it and how you're responding with it. What are other ways we can set up that hook? specific to a response to a specific event. So that's definitely a good example. So you can present a specific event and like kind of why it's important or what happened, and then lead that into this conversation of language diversity. Can you guys think of a specific event where language diversity is really important for that conversation, or like for what happened during that event? The ice guy in New York. I'm trying to think, who's the ice guy in New York? Is that like what happened with that one? It sounds familiar. Is it similar to like the different videos of different Karens yelling at people? Talk about language diversity, the fact that we call people Karens now. I don't know if people can name their kids Karen ever again. Yeah, I think that was what I was thinking of, James. So the lawyer yelling at Spanish-speaking employees, definitely. So you can present basically that event or even that situation, because sadly that's a situation that we've seen on social media happening like repeatedly.
Right.
So you can talk about like that happens because of lack of understanding of language diversity or acceptance of it. So that would definitely be a good hook.
Okay.
So you can describe that event or similar events happening. So you would define it, so really define that issue and define what discourse communities are and like basically why we're having this conversation about them. So essentially we're setting up that context for how you're responding. So one thing to note, since part of the prompt said to consider the specific texts, right? So we use Nietos, we use McWhorter, and we use specifically Hessler. Oh, sorry, I missed something. So in the chat, Raymond said, bring up something that the audience could maybe relate to. Yeah, so that's definitely something you can do as well. So if they related to seeing something happen like that ice guy in New York, or if they had a similar experience of maybe feeling like an outsider, or going to a new place and being able to communicate because of a certain kind of, they're part of the same discourse community, that could work as well. But this section, in terms of introducing the articles, in most cases when we're responding to specific texts, so even if you're not necessarily using them, we typically want to introduce them in our introduction so that we're setting up the context for them. Any idea as to why we would introduce them? Even though we're not analyzing them, you might not necessarily be bringing in quotes in your body paragraphs for them. That's optional. Why is it important to introduce the articles that you've read and what they're about?
I mean, our paper's based on their ideas and examples. So even, like you said, even if you don't reference them, it's something it's not necessarily giving them the credit per se, but it's also one of those things where if somebody wanted to read more into your paper, or see, where you might be coming from, then they can kind of reference that as well.
Definitely. So they can like find those. And then of course, I really like how you say like not necessarily give them credit, because that's a really good point, but you're acknowledging that your response is kind of inspired or responding to some of their points. So even though you might not be using them in your body paragraphs, like you're part of the conversation that they started for us as a discourse community, for us as a class. So another way that we can look at that is by presenting those sources you're establishing that you know about this topic, so you guys are able to talk about it because of the information that you got reading those articles and of course analyzing those articles. So one thing to note for this, so even though like us as a class, we know the full names of the authors, in academic essays, you never want to assume that your audience knows the full name. So you always, when you're introducing them for the first time, you always want to use their first and last name, and of course the full titles of their work, just to make that clear. One thing to note, so for names of titles for works, when we're introducing them, we have two different ways that we introduce titles, and that has to do with the types of work. So we have titles that are the names of the entire work. So that would be the overall book title, or like the name of a newspaper or magazine, like the New York Times. So whenever we have the title of a whole work, so the whole book, the whole publication, that would always be in italics. And whenever we have the name of a title that was published in something, or a chapter from a book, or a poem from a collection, that would always be in quotations. So when you introduce the article titles in your introduction, you always want to have the article titles in quotation marks. So very similar to how in the prompt, I have the article titles in quotation marks, you would do that in the same way. And then you would keep the capitalization rules that the author used within their title. So any questions about that or in the introduction? So after you introduce them, you just have a brief summary that could just be within the same sentence or even just like one sentence. Then we get to our thesis statement. We don't need to go into too much depth about those sources. We're just acknowledging that they added this to this conversation for us before we're adding our own experiences to inform readers about them. So we can see in how this is breaking down, it really follows that upside down triangle organization by starting broad and then narrowing that subject until we have your thesis. So questions about the intro or questions about the thesis? So for our body paragraphs, we've already talked a little bit about it earlier when we were going over that prompt. So our body paragraph organization, of course, generally in rules, we want to have a new paragraph whenever you change topics. So whenever you're shifting from responding to one question to another, or if you're talking about essentially when you're going from talking about being an insider versus outsider to going to basically how your language has changed or how you use language in your different discourse communities. So you want to make sure to shift. And of course, another rule is that if a paragraph is getting too long, and that's generally when a paragraph is getting to be like a full page or longer, typically we want to shorten it. So we want to figure out a way to separate that into smaller paragraphs. So typically split it into two. And then of course for expository essays, which is what the root of this one is with that inform being as part of the instructions, that rule of thumb could be to separate the body paragraphs based on those questions or based on the concepts you're focusing on. So depending, for those body paragraphs, the organization would stay fairly the same. It would just differ depending on which question you're responding to. The biggest thing for body paragraphs is for the topic sentence, right? The first sentence should always be a topic sentence. So you should want to avoid beginning straight away with your example. You want to make that connection to your thesis really clear. So if we think of like the thesis example that you guys had with language diversity, right? Here, this is when we're going to get more specific. So if I'm responding to the question about feeling like an insider or outsider within discourse communities, you could have that in that topic sentence. So we could have generally, I could have a response or a topic sentence that's beginning with, there are discourse communities that have made me feel like an insider and an outsider. And then you can get into specifically which ones those are. So if we think of the example, I want to say it was James, let me double check. Yeah, James' example about learning a new language. You could have specifically a new language, or say you were learning, in my case, I was learning French. So learning a new language or learning French has made me feel like an insider and an outsider. And I can talk about that. So the biggest thing for topic sentences, it's just really wanting to make it clear how you're responding and fulfilling the requirements for the prompts. So then it's guiding that how I should read it, or how your audience should read the different examples and the different explanations that you're going to have as that paragraph progresses. So for those body paragraphs, we've already talked a little bit about that. So that's where our examples and our evidence would come in. So of course that could be, if you want, you could have a quote. So that can be like a quote from an article if you're comparing your own experience to what an article is saying. Or it could be even a quote from what somebody said to you, or what you heard somebody say about your experiences with learning, with language diversity. For instance, as we guys have we've talked about, like, I'm half Filipino and I don't speak Tagalog, or I only know the curse words, let's be honest. That's what my cousins chose to teach me. So I've been around my family and I've been with my cousins, and they would be talking and then they'll use a Tagalog, like a word, and I would be confused and I'd be like, oh yeah, you're just mestiza, which means like you're mixed, you're not like full Filipino. So I can present that experience and present that quote of what my cousin told me as an example of how that made me feel like an outsider, like I wasn't Filipino enough because I didn't speak the language to know what he was talking about. Does that make sense, how I could use a quote in terms of illustrating a point? Awesome. So examples, a personal anecdote, if you want to do for the different paragraphs, cause and effects, right? You have basically a lot of options for how that you want to organize that, because it's all focused on how you want to inform your audience, and of course what experiences you're talking about, because it's really rooted in you sharing your experience with language diversity and discourse communities with your audience. The biggest thing, like in the end, in order to wrap up a body paragraph, typically you want to have a few sentences, usually at least 2 sentences that are just referring back to that topic sentence or back to your thesis, and kind of wrapping up how your examples illustrate that point you're making. So that could be, my experience with my cousin illustrates how discourse communities can make you feel like an insider and an outsider. Or it could be like, this shows how language within your language can change over time based on the discourse communities you become a part of. But just reinforcing that idea that you are emphasizing for your reader and responding to that prompt. Any questions or concerns about body paragraphs? We have someone said nope in the chat. If you do, just feel free to let me know. As I said in successful papers, the biggest thing I'm looking for is the clear examples and clear topic sentences. So you really have a lot of options in terms of how you're focusing on how you're illustrating that point. So I did have questions of transitions between paragraphs. So in terms of transitions between paragraphs, I know I've commonly seen in previous student papers have students transitioning at the end of a body paragraph to the next body paragraph. I find that personally unnecessary for most informative pieces of writing, especially because that's what the topic sentence does. So I wouldn't worry too much about transitions between paragraphs as long as like you're wrapping up your discussion of the examples you have, because that's what a topic sentence is really focusing on. I would say transitions between paragraphs, that's only really important if, for instance, a paragraph is getting really long in this paper and you're not necessarily changing topics, the paragraph's just getting long and you just want to split it in two so that it avoids becoming kind of confusing. Because I don't know, you guys maybe have had this experience. The reason we shorten paragraphs once they get too long is so that a reader is less likely to get lost in the paragraph, because of course the longer the paragraph, the more likely the reader is going to forget what the initial topic sentence was, or like the point of the paragraph itself, or even just get lost of like where they were within the structure. So when you're splitting up a larger paragraph, right, typically the transition for that would be kind of really relative depending on like when you're splitting it up. So I would say like if you do want some help with that, I can cover that during my conferencing with you next week to go over it, just because that's really specific depending on how you're responding and like how long your body paragraphs are for this essay. Awesome. Any other questions? So finally, for our conclusion, right, just as we talked about with the intro and probably what you guys have heard in other English classes, our conclusions typically mirror our introductory paragraph. So instead of having that upside down triangle, now we have just the right side up triangle. So really it's a way of basically organizationally like signaling to our audience that we are done with the conversation that we are engaging in with them. So the biggest thing for the organization of the conclusion is typically we start with restating our thesis statement. So that's a really nice way of wrapping up and signaling that this is the last essay, like the last paragraph of your essay. And it just reinforces all of the different points that you made in your body paragraphs. And then you do have a lot of options. So the biggest thing for a conclusion paragraph is you want to avoid summarizing all of the different points that you presented, primarily because like if you can summarize it in one paragraph, like what was the point for your audience to read all of the body paragraphs about it? It just essentially, it starts to become repetitive. So after restating the thesis, like you do have options because we want to go back to that overall context again to really broaden the point. So one strategy that you can do for that is to end in a similar way, kind of referring back to the authors. So you can talk about how your experiences like add to theirs to really kind of clarify the different issues, because of course with language diversity, nobody necessarily has the same experience. And of course it's changing over time. So you can broaden it that way. You can end with like a specific point or call to action for your audience. So your audience to maybe be more understanding of different discourse communities or be more aware of language diversity and not assume that everybody communicates in the same way as they do. Similar to in that example we had in the chat, the ice guy, who is the lawyer yelling at Spanish-speaking employees. So you can talk about how, right, call to action so that we can fight against that, or so people know that that's just not okay and that they should just be more aware of language is not set in stone, right? And not everybody has the same way of communicating. You guys think of other options for ending that conclusion? Or any questions about the conclusion? The biggest thing for what I'm looking for is I just want to make sure that you guys are avoiding summarizing the points that you presented in your body paragraphs. So if you need specific help with that, we can also cover that during conferencing or through email as well. So that is it for what I had planned to go over for drafting for this paper. So do you guys have any final questions? I wanted to leave the end of class with some time for me to help you guys out or give you guys some individual feedback or brainstorming help. Any questions about next week with conferencing, the rough draft, the peer review, or if anything for drafting? Okay. So if you guys don't have any questions, those who do want to kind of have some one-on-one time to talk about it for like the remainder of our class period, since we have about a half hour left, you guys can stay. If you guys feel like you're good, you guys can just log out of Zoom early and then let me know if you have any issues over email. And of course, just make sure to sign up for your conferencing appointment. But for those who aren't staying around to ask me any specific questions, have a good weekend. And of course, good luck working on your rough drafts.
Professor, I have a question.
Thanks.
Okay,